Now we're going to move on to something a little bit more challenging. We are going to use this pen and ink drawing of a rose, and we're going to try and do our own version of it. One thing that I forgot to mention in the last video is that I have a coloring book under my paper. My table that I'm drawing on is very hard, just like the ones in our classroom, and it has some like divots in it, which would definitely mess up my drawing if I'm not careful. So putting a stack of copy paper or like a paper pad underneath, or your portfolio, as long as it doesn't have like a bunch of raised areas from splatter paint or something on it, would work great to put under your drawing to kind of create a cushion for your pen to color on. I just found it a lot easier to actually blend my pen when I had a cushion underneath. So again, I start with my darkest areas. I don't actually color them as dark, or I try not to color them as dark as I see them in my reference photo. I'm just starting with my dark areas to try and get comfortable with the pen and ink technique again, because again, no matter how many times I've practiced, every time I put pen to paper, I always get a little bit nervous because it just feels so permanent. The only thing to remember with this is if you accidentally get a little bit too dark with your midtones and you kind of get a little bit too dark with the overall drawing, all you need to do is go in and actually darken your shadows even more. Try and make your shadows the super dark, and it will still create that contrast. It'll still create that dimensional look, that 3D drawing look, as it just might be that your whole drawing ends up being darker than your reference photo. And you'll see that in the end with my rose. My rose, it's blended, it turns out okay, but it ends up much darker than the one that I'm working from, and that's fine too. So again, like we're trying the blended technique with the pen and ink, and that's where I'm not actually coloring. It looks like I am, but I'm not actually coloring with the very tip of my ballpoint pen. I'm almost using like the side of my ballpoint pen and just barely brushing the ink on the paper. And I'm not actually pressing down very hard either. I'm not even really pressing down at all. I'm just letting my pen rest on the paper, and then I just kind of gradually layer the pen and ink until it gets darker. I do kind of start by, especially with the flower, I start by like defining the edge of the flower petal. It just kind of helps to create a nice start for me, to help me to define my different areas. So I might go around the flower petal and kind of create a little bit of what looks like an outline, but then I go in and I blend it out. Remember when we practiced graphite drawing, we don't want outlines, we want edges. So I don't actually outline all of my petals like it looks like I did with the pencil. I actually just go in and I just blend out my shadows so that it looks more realistic. So really try and focus. If you have really dark outlines where you outline something with the pen, try and blend that outline out to a mid-tone and then gradually to a highlight so that it looks more realistic. It's easy to get discouraged if you are not able to completely blend out your pen and ink with this project. So if you can see, if you were to zoom in on my drawing, mine doesn't look so blended as much as it does almost like a cross-hatching technique. So if you're really struggling, if you do one petal and you're really struggling to try and color lightly to create the blended technique, then don't stress. Try a different technique in the next petal. This practice sheet is not meant to look perfect in the end. It's meant for you to find what you really think works best for you. If that's stippling, if that's cross-hatching, if that's hatching, or even scribbling. I guess mine kind of looks most like scribbling, and it tends to take a little bit of the pressure off for me if I think of it as scribbling. But whatever technique works best for you, practice the different techniques on the different petals. Whatever you like the best, whatever you feel most comfortable with, use that one, not just for your practice, but for your actual project. The whole point of the practice is just getting used to the pen and ink and finding a way to make it work for you rather than you get discouraged and give up on the assignment. Just because something's challenging doesn't mean that you shouldn't try and master it. So take this challenge on, see how you can make it work for you. Something else to keep in mind with our drawing is that we are working on a really small drawing right now for our practice, so all of our marks are very small and tight. But for a larger sheet of paper, when you're drawing something much larger, you actually need to use broader strokes, especially for your mid-tone to highlights, because using broader strokes will help you to blend it out. Using really tight, small circular motions and mark making techniques is very difficult to blend out, so just kind of keep that in mind. I'm still turning my paper around and around to try and get that directional shading, so I'm kind of trying to shade in the direction that the petal appears to be going in. Each petal kind of starts from the center and then folds its way outward, so I'm trying to kind of follow that same path with my mark making techniques to really enhance the realistic feel of the drawing. Something else that I didn't really mention is that, like, let's say this was your actual project. You would begin by very lightly blocking out your drawing before you put in your details, and then you would kind of go to the next step, which is putting in your details with a pencil, always drawing lightly, and then you would begin your actual pen and ink drawing. So make sure that you're starting out with a really loose, lightly drawn outline of your subject matter, and make sure you don't have too much negative space in the background, because you're going to have to find a way to shade the background and use as much pen and ink as you can across the paper. So do yourself a favor and just go ahead and whatever you're drawing for your project, fill up the entire paper, fill up the entire space, so that you don't have just a lot of blank space in the background to shade. You may have noticed that I occasionally wipe off the end of my pen or scrape off the end of my pen on the side of my paper. The reason I do that is because the ink tends to build up at the end of the pen and then just splurt out on your paper, and it just looks not good because it's usually not in a place that you want it to be. So make sure you're periodically just cleaning off the end of your pen to try and prevent any random dark blotches on your paper. Okay, so now I'm going to speed up my drawing so that you can see what it looks like in the end. As you can tell, it's not very blended. It's more of a scribbling technique I ended up using. That's what worked best for me. I go back and I darken all my shadows as dark as I can to really create contrast. If you go back and you darken all your shadows as dark as you can, that really creates more dimension for your overall drawing. And my drawing in general turned out much darker, but I actually love it.